Welcome back to the Gem Cutter's Craft. This is Justin K. Prim, and today I want to respond to a viewer question that came from one of the comments of a talk video that I posted a couple of days ago. Now, if you didn't see the talk, it's called 21st Century Jam Peg Cutting, But Why? And essentially, it's just an exploration into what is the jam peg and why would I, who already know how to use all these other types of faceting machines, want to delve into this sort of antique art of jam peg cutting. So in the comments from that video, we have a really great question from Show Me What You Can Make, Not What You Can Buy, 8427. They say, so do you think that by doing a test in a lab, a stone cut on a jam peg will have as much refraction of light after being faceted almost by eye and skill as a stone cut in a more advanced mechanical mass machine, that you will cut every angle with the same symmetry and precision? Maybe a skillful cutter can get close to getting the most out of a stone's brilliance and reflection of light, but with the massed mechanical machine following the diagram, not guessing the angles, under a lab test, that stone will have more perfect results than a stone cut in a jam peg machine. What would your opinion on this be? Now, I really like this question, and it's a complicated question. There's a lot of little parts to it that I want to address. I really appreciate the question, and it's an important question because it really gets to the heart of why I'm even doing this. I even took notes. Usually when I make these kind of videos, I just hit record and go, but in this case, I really wanted to make sure I hit on every point. So first of all, in the question, he says, if we took the stone to a lab, if we did a lab test, and I think this is the first place we just need to pause the question. To our friend who's posed the question, I don't want you to feel like I'm picking on you in any way. This answer is going out to the entire community of gem cutters, and I think that it's really important that we understand why we are cutting stones. Now, to pose the question, if we took the stone into a lab, what are we speaking about here? We really need to consider, when we're taking our gemstone and faceting it, what's the end point? And I think for the American audience or for the mechanical mass machine audience, we maybe have lost our plot a little bit. Of course, the gemstone is for jewelry and for no other purpose. If there was no jewelry and no adornment and history of adornment, we would not be talking about this right now because we would have no jam peg, we would have no masked machine. It doesn't matter which country you look into. The point of gem cutting is for adornment, it's for beauty, it's for personal pleasure, and sometimes, of course, it's for storing wealth, in the form of money as a currency of a gemstone. But I don't want to talk about storing wealth. Let's just talk about the jewelry, the beauty. The reason why we're cutting stones is to sell them to a customer who's going to put them into jewelry and then, wear those as rings or necklaces or earrings or whatever it may be. So as I go through this question, everything else that I'm going to say has to be framed around that. There is no ultimate scientific objective. There's no laboratory that is going to take our stone and say, yes, it is perfect, because who cares? Ultimately, who cares? If the stone can sell, if a jeweler wants to buy it or your customer wants to buy it, it is a success. It is a win. Now, that's a big statement because there's so many ugly gemstones out there that get sold. There's so many ugly gemstones with windows and bad angles and bad polishing that are in jewelry and are being worn possibly by you. So we have to really consider, what is our ultimate goal here? It is really fun to explore these hypothetical situations, and I know I'm doing that here on YouTube, but if we're really going to get down to what is the point of this and why would we choose one machine over another, we have to really be honest with ourselves and know that some of these little details that we're asking ultimately don't really matter. So the question says, could someone on a jam peg get as much refraction and reflection of light and color from the jam peg as they could with a mass machine, with hard numbers, with hard data? We obviously know the refractive index of all the stones. All of our gemology knowledge informs us about what angles will create a reflection or a lack of window. So we know this number. It's a hard number. If it's a sapphire, then we don't want to go below 34.5. If it's a beryl, I think we don't want to go below something like 39.2 or something like that. So we know these hard numbers, but we have to also understand that the critical angle or the design around the critical angle doesn't automatically mean a stone is beautiful. There are a lot of other things that we need to understand besides just strictly angles. Angles are important. I wouldn't put them down in any way. We need to know the angles too, but there's other things. There's a lot of important numbers that we need to know. For instance, crown height proportion. Do you have a really deep crown? Do you have a really shallow crown? Pavilion proportion. Do you have a really flat pavilion? Do you have a really deep pavilion? Length versus width. Is the stone really long? Is it really wide? Is it really bulky? You know, maybe the crown and the pavilion are too deep for the length and width of that stone. So ultimately, the factor that we need to talk about is beauty. The beauty is what's going to sell the stone. Nothing else is going to sell the stone but beauty. But beauty is not something that we can easily quantify. So we're going to break it down into some numbers. Obviously, we've already said critical angle, very important. We don't want to window the stone because beauty in a gemstone means reflecting color and reflecting light. So if you have less color reflected, less light reflected, then of course the beauty value is down. So we don't want a window. That's easy to understand. But we also don't want the stone to be too deep to be set by the jeweler. We don't want it to be too flat so it's not giving its best luster, its best reflection, its best brilliance. We don't want the stone to be too long because it doesn't sit in a setting correctly. It doesn't really work with most kinds of jewelry and most kinds of setting other than a very eccentric one. So those are a couple different factors that I would put into the category of beauty. You know, the pavilion proportion and the respect of the critical angle, the crown proportion and the respect to the general height of the stone not going too deep or too shallow, and then appropriate length and width so that the stone is pleasing to the eye. The outline shape is pleasing to the eye. It's not too long, it's not too short. If you're working with calibrated stones, then it actually fits into the calibrated setting. So these are all factors in beauty, but you can take the ugliest piece of rough and give it the most beautiful cut, and it will still be an ugly stone. So there's still more to this question of beauty than just these numbers. And that's where the JPEG cutter really comes into it, because, and I'm going to generalize a lot here, but I would say that your average JPEG cutter, and I'm talking about professional JPEG cutters, wherever they may be in the world, are going to know a lot about proportioning, because they don't know and they don't think about stones in a numerical way. They're not thinking about angles as certain numbers. They're thinking about the shape of the pavilion, the shape of the crown, the shape of the outside of the stone, you know, the girdle shape of the stone. And their whole training has been about how to look and see whether this proportion of the crown is too shallow or too steep, whether this shape of the oval is pleasing to the eye or it's not because maybe it's too long, or the corners are too bulky, or the sides are mismatched, or whatever the case may be. The JPEG cutter, in my experience, typically has the most experience with shaping the stone, shaping the crown, shaping the pavilion, and all of this is just preforming. We're not even getting into the faceting yet. So if you've been trained, and let's just specifically talk about French cutting here, because this is a French machine and I've been working with French cutters and talking to French cutters, and the talk that I gave was mostly talking about French cutters. You know, if you've been trained to cut gemstones for the highest and most specialized jewelry companies in the world, being those ones in Place Vendôme, the high jewelers of Paris. If you've been trained to cut stones for them, and they are the biggest, most wealthy, most successful jewelry brands that have ever been made in the history of the world, then theoretically you should be a master of creating the perfect stone, creating the most beautiful shape, proportion, faceting pattern, polishing, all the stuff that we look for in stones. If you've been trained that way, then theoretically you should be able to be making the best stones in the world, or at least taking the rough that you have access to and giving them their best look. Now, if you're somebody in America or somewhere else in Europe, or even somewhere in France who's a hobby cutter, and you haven't been trained this way, you've never worked with jewelers, you have no idea what the customers are asking for, or what the high jewelry houses are asking for, or what your average typical engagement ring wearer is asking for, or your jeweler is asking for, then how do you know how to cut a stone? Most people who cut stones for fun learn through either diagrams or books or from other hobby cutters. Now, if you're learning this way, then yes, technically you can know how to cut a stone, Just like technically you can learn how to sew from a sewing book, but do you know how to make a garment that looks beautiful on the body? Do you know how to make a shirt or a pair of pants that sits well and shapes the body correctly and makes someone look more attractive than they would be if they weren't wearing your clothes? You can learn how to do a thing without learning how to do it well or correctly. You can learn how to cut wood and sand it and drill it together and still make a table that falls down. These are the questions, these very, very subtle things of what makes something beautiful. This is exactly why I wanted to delve into the question and the process of jam peg cutting, because when I started to talk to the jam peg cutters and the way that they spoke to me about stones was completely different. It was fresh. It was using words and phrases that I've never heard being applied to gemstones. For instance, this idea that a stone should be charming, that it should have a certain life and a certain feeling to it. Honestly, I never heard anybody in America talking about the charm of a stone. It's always about the number of facets, the percentage of brightness, things like that. And those things are valid too, but I know those things already. Personally, for me, in my own journey, I've already gone through the journey of making designs in GemCut Studio and optimizing for the perfect brilliance and, practicing and practicing to try to understand how to get good yield and how to get good color. And these are things that the software really doesn't inform us about at all. So when I want to get into the subtleties of gem cutting, and when I want to talk and lecture about the subtleties of gem cutting, we have to get past the idea of these numbers, because these numbers can only take us so far. The software can only take us so far, and then all that's left after that is human feeling. And human feeling is actually the thing that sells the stone. So it's quite possible that human feeling is our most important attribute. Beauty in the stone is our most important factor, because again, beauty is what sells the stone. Color, shape, a beautiful pattern of reflection, and then of course, there's carat weight, there's the price per carat. These are very important as well, but we can't really affect those things. We can buy our rough and we can try to buy the best rough we can, and then we can give the rough the best treatment that we know how to do. And so what I'm doing here with the jam peg, or what I'm trying to learn from these French masters, is what is the treatment that they're able to give the stone? What qualities are they seeing in the rough that I haven't learned how to see yet? What ability do they have to bring out the life of the stone and shape it from the rough, exclude inclusions, bring out certain qualities? And I honestly have felt that there's something missing from my own cutting, because when I look at a piece of rough, I don't think I'm seeing what they're seeing, because when they tell me what they see, they're not seeing it the same way I am. And so this is what I want to learn. This is my approach to mastery. So we have to consider beauty as our number one attribute. Beauty also means color of the stone. So if you have a bad rough, it's not going to be beautiful. If it's an ugly color, it's not going to be beautiful. If it's too flat, it could be beautiful, but it's going to have to be too small. So to go to the next part of the question, he says, skill of the cutter versus mass machine using the diagram to get the most out of the stone. So I would argue that getting the most out of the stone is not just brilliance. When we use the software to figure out our designs, the number one number that we can get out of the software is brilliance factor, the percentage of brilliance. Is the stone very bright or is it very dull? Is it in the middle? Is it leaking light with the window? But brilliance percentage doesn't tell us anything about color. And there is a very strong relationship between brilliance and color saturation. And a lot of times, for many stones, making more brilliance means losing some color. And sometimes choosing to use a cut that optimizes for color might lose some brilliance. Though I find actually most of the designs have great brilliance. Most of the step cut and mixed cut designs, even though they're optimized for color, the brilliance is actually still there. So I found it rare to find a design that really brings out the color and makes the stone look dull. It's just not usually the case. So yield. This is really important, and this is something that I think that probably the professional French cutters or the professional jam peg cutters of anywhere in the world are going to outshine the mass cutters. The yield is always really important for the professional cutters because they're getting paid per carat, and it's very important to their customer that they don't lose the yield. So getting a good yield, a high yield, is important as long as you're still getting the beauty factor. If you sacrifice beauty to get yield, then of course that's not acceptable. But if you can balance these two, yield and beauty, color, brilliance, and everything else, get them even, that's the perfect blend. That's what we need to do as cutters. So we've got yield, color, extremely important. The color that you get out of the stone is directly going to influence the price per carat. I would also argue that the colored stone cutters of Paris who specialize in some of the most expensive gemstones in the world, and specifically rubies, sapphires, and emeralds, this is their bread and butter. A competent cutter who's been cutting for more than a few years, again, because they know how to shape the crown, they know how to shape the pavilion, they know how to get the perfect shape out of the outline, they're going to be more intuitively in touch with getting good color because they know these subtle things about adjusting the stone for what it is. If you only have a diagram, that's a hypothetical situation. The diagram is an imaginary object. Then we have our real stone. If the diagram and the real stone aren't perfectly suited, you're not getting the best out of that stone. You're getting something less than the best. If your training is all about how to look at a stone and figure out how to get the best out of it, you're obviously going to be better at it than someone who's just used to cutting from a diagram and not adjusting any angles, not adjusting the shape, and just making your rough conform to the shape of the diagram, even if it wasn't perfectly matched to it. And I would say that anyone who's doing that still has a lot to learn. Something that I used to do, and I've grown out of it now because this is a skill that I've been able to pick up along the way. Then we have this idea that not every piece of rough is the same. Even if you know everything about cutting sapphires, for the hardness of sapphire and the polishing of sapphire, does that automatically mean that you know how to adjust a diagram or adjust a pattern to get the best out of a dark sapphire versus a medium tone sapphire versus a pastel sapphire? This is another very important skill, and being able to adjust those angles a little bit and compensate for the darkness or the lightness of the stone means that you're going to potentially bring out the best of that stone. And again, this is really important. It's all coming back to beauty, yield, and really what treatment can we give the stone to get the best out of it. So ultimately, it's not just about angles. It's not about getting every single angle exactly the same so that the stone is perfectly centered and perfectly proportioned that someone with a microscope in a lab might be able to test and say, okay, he's got a 42.0 degree angle on every one of these main facets. It's perfect. No, this is not the case. I have had so many times where, for instance, my friend Ken in England, who's a master emerald cutter, he's told me so many times that to get the best out of an emerald on the bottom of the stone, not every facet can be the same angle. The color isn't always in the middle of the stone. So if you've got every facet going to a point and that point is perfectly reflecting the middle of the stone, well, what happens when the color's over here? Or what happens when there's an inclusion right in the middle or right over on the side? You might need to adjust the angle here and adjust the angle here, which would make the bottom of the stone a little bit lopsided, but maybe that is the best thing for the stone. Maybe not every stone is supposed to be perfectly centered with a keel line or a culet point. Again, these are subtleties. These are advanced ideas that I'm hoping will give you guys a little bit of inspiration or maybe make you think about some things that you've never thought about, because before I got into this JamPeg journey, there was a lot of stuff that I hadn't thought about. And if we go, so many years back, when I was still using a mast machine and then transitioned into the handpiece machine and started working with professional cutters who retrained me, there was so many things that I had never thought about. Until that point, I was literally just thinking about getting the best angle, getting the best brightness, getting the perfect meet points. And what I'm learning more and more and more is that is almost the least important thing. It has to come back to yield, beauty, value. If we lose value, what we're doing is pointless. If we lose beauty, what we're doing is pointless. If the yield goes down too far, then we've probably lost too much of the value, and again, it's pointless. So finally, in the question, he says, if we could take it into the lab for a test, wouldn't they more realistically find perfect results on the mast cut stone than the JamPeg stone with the cutter who has some skill but is just sort of guessing everything? Now, yeah, if we did take it into this hypothetical non-existent laboratory and they could test every facet, yeah, I think for sure the mast machine would definitely have more perfectly executed angles around the entire stone. The chance that every single angle is the exact same angle is probably a lot closer. And I think I've already made a short video showing how when we use this JamPeg machine, it's not even possible to get the same angle around the entire stone because as we turn the stone around, in the case of this oval, the long side is raising up and the low side is coming down a little bit. So as I go around the stone's going up and down because the stone's pushing it up, and I'm not adjusting the height of the jam peg to make sure that every single angle is at 35 degrees. Some are at 34.5, some are at 35, maybe some are at 35.3. I don't know, and honestly, I don't care. But in some of the small tests that I've done already, it seems like some of these adjustments of the angle, or some of the automatic compensations that the jam peg does by pushing the stone up and down, possibly make the stone look better than when every single angle is exactly the same. Why is that? I'm not totally sure. Could anyone really tell in real life? Probably only a little bit. So it's not really a point worth arguing whether the jam peg cuts a better stone than the mast. But I think it is an important distinction to say there's a big difference between a cutter who knows how to cut a perfect stone by the diagram on a mast than someone who's been trained to cut a stone for the needs of a jeweler, and someone who's been trained to cut very expensive, very potentially beautiful stones for the jeweler. To me, that training, it has to be the best training. It's the training that's specific for the needs of the stone, which is why I started this video saying this idea of perfection in the laboratory, it's pointless because all the stones are eventually just going into jewelry. Ultimately, stones get dirty, stones get abraded, and stones lose luster over time. So the entire journey of the stone it's only getting worse. And only when it's just straight off of our dopstick is it perfect, because even by the time the jeweler gets their hands on it, they probably already chipped the edges a little bit, and they're hiding some of the stone with prongs or a bezel setting, and the setting itself maybe is blocking some light from going into the stone. So there's so many subtle factors. And I want to thank you for this question. And I hope you don't feel like I'm picking on you or that I haven't answered the question very well. I don't think it's very wise to directly compare machine to machine, which is why I haven't made a video directly doing that. It's why I'm doing this journey to learn the jam peg, because there are still things to learn from every type of machine. The handpiece taught me things, the mast machine taught me things, the jam peg has taught me things. And I think ultimately, once I finish this journey, combining the understanding of all the different machines and all the different techniques and subtle treatments that the cutters do, along with all of the stuff I've learned about gemology and all of the years of looking at different materials, different pieces of rough, different stones, and seeing how they go from rough to cut or cut to recut. These are the subtle and long-term experiences that make one into a master. It's not about the angles necessarily. It's not about any of these individual factors. We have to sum all of that stuff up into beauty, even though it's impossible to quantify beauty. So I will leave you there today, a meditation on beauty, if you will. Thank you for letting me have this dialogue on this question and let me really understand what I think about this journey of the jam peg and what does it mean to be perfect, or what does it mean to be perfectly beautiful. This has been Justin K. Prim for the Gem Cutter's Craft. Thank you once again for joining me. If you've been enjoying these free YouTube videos and you want to help make this channel stay alive and stay free and stay fun, I welcome you to join me on Patreon. This is a way that fans are supporting me with a small monthly donation. It starts as little as $3 a month and goes as high as you want to take it. And this enables me to keep the channel for free and spend more time making videos and thinking about these philosophical questions so that I can present the answers to you. It also gets you my twice a month podcast where I talk to jewelers, gem cutters, gemologists, and all kinds of people from the gemstone world so that we can get these kind of different opinions that hopefully will let us have a better understanding about why we're doing what we're doing as gem cutters and how we can get better. I think if we understand the mindset of the jeweler, the mindset of the buyer, the mindset of the gemologist, this is going to make us a better cutter. And this is why I've started this podcast. So if you want to listen to the podcast, join me on Patreon. The link is below. And if not, I'll see you right here on YouTube next time on the Gem Cutter's Craft. See you then.